Picking a church is hard. And it's so hard that most of my videos exist to help people try to make sense of the competing claims of Protestantism, Catholicism, and Orthodoxy. And that is a daunting task of taking up the history, the theology, and sorting through it to try to do your best to land where you sense God is leading you and what is the true church, if that is singular or plural. But today I'm going to be getting a bit more in the weeds into a more intramural debate within Protestantism. So if you're Catholic or Orthodox, you are more than welcome to watch this, but I'm going to be speaking to Protestants specifically. Because it used to be, at least in my experience, that the way a Protestant chose a church was, kind of simple. You looked at what you believe based on what you've read in Scripture, and then you try to find a church that matches with that. Now, you might do this in more or less theologically highbrow ways. You might go through kind of the statement of faith for your local non-denominational church, or you might be reading like the 1689 London Baptist Confession or anything like that. And obviously, this takes on a lot of different shapes and sizes. It goes on for different durations, but for the most part, that's kind of how you did it. And for me growing up, when you picked a church, I grew up in a non-denominational church. You're pretty much going to look at churches whose worship music you liked, one that had people your age that you could get to know, that had maybe a good groups ministries, areas you could serve, and preaching that you agreed with. That was kind of what you're looking at, in addition to kind of looking at the doctrinal statement. And that was all fair enough. It never would have crossed my mind, though, for most of my life to look at a mainline church. Even when I went for my undergrad in theology, as I started to learn more about theology, looking at the mainline itself, depending on how we define it, which is going to come up more, wasn't something that I'd really consider. Maybe if you were feeling really wild and crazy, you'd look at an ACNA church, an Anglican church in North America. Sorry, lots of inside baseball here today. But the Episcopal Church or some of these kind of dead mainlines, it wouldn't have crossed my mind. But in recent years, especially online, Redeemed Zoomer, a Protestant YouTuber, has garnered a huge audience, and it has been primarily through, I suppose, his really interesting explainer videos, but also what he's become known for, even more so than that, is his call for the Reconquista, to take back the mainline denominations, to kind of restore them to orthodoxy. And a big part of that is calling out non-denominationalism and saying, hey, I want to take people, as Redeemed Zoomer, from non-denominationalism and bring them into the mainline churches. Well, that has come to a head recently with Gavin Ortland, who, to my knowledge, attends a non-denominational church, having previously been a Baptist pastor. And they had a conversation. Should you go mainline or evangelical? And throughout the conversation, they had to kind of define these terms as those could overlap, evangelical and mainline, and they are used in very different ways. Now, in this video, what I want to do is kind of go through, if you're in this position where you're deciding between kind of a run-of-the-mill evangelical church that's mostly, I would say, represented by either Baptist or non-denominational churches, not exclusively, but we could say primarily in the U.S., or if you're looking for the mainline and kind of the Reconquista vein of Redeemed Zoomer, how do you make that decision? Now, the basic argument I understand from Richard, Redeemed Zoomer, is that you want to look for a mainline church, but it doesn't have to be any mainline church. That he has a whole map of kind of more faithful mainline churches. Now, within that, you're still going to have questions, though, right? And something that comes up a lot in the video that he did with Gavin Ortland is what level of kind of discomfort or disagreement can you have? There's a kind of noteworthy part where Gavin says something akin to, I'd rather worship Jesus in a sewer with orthodoxy than in a cathedral with heresy. I might be butchering it slightly, but that was the basic idea, whereas Redeemed Zoomer seemed a bit more comfortable with certain levels of disagreements on kind of maybe secondary theological issues, potentially even primary. There's an interesting back and forth about whether or not you could go to a church where the pastor doesn't believe in the resurrection. But within the whole project, no matter how faithful that mainline church is, I think there's an expectation that you're going into it with a sense of this being like a mission field. After all, you're on a mission to kind of reconquer or redeem these mainline churches, and along the way, you might have to stomach a level of discomfort with doctrine or practice, but that is all kind of worth it in the long run as you are seeking to take back these historic institutions for the good of the gospel. Well, that's going to lead to a lot of difficult questions, though, at a practical level. And I want to look at 3 key questions to help you, as a Protestant, maybe sort through this question of should you go mainline, should you go evangelical? How do you make that decision given different kind of contingencies? And then at the end, I'll also share kind of how I've thought through this myself and where that's landed my wife and I as far as where we go to church. So the 3 questions I want to look at are: what is Protestantism? What is the gospel? And what's most important? Okay, small questions. We'll try to wrap those up quickly. But what is Protestantism? Here already we can notice certain disagreements between maybe what you think of as Protestantism, what Redeemed Zoomer thinks of it, what Gavin Orton thinks. And I'm going to highlight at least 2 ways of looking at Protestantism. There could certainly be more than this, but these 2 might be helpful. The first is to see Protestantism as a movement, specifically a renewal movement within the one church. This is the way that I've heard Gavin describe it. It's similar to the way that I believe Matthew Barrett describes it in his really excellent book on the Protestant Reformation. You should definitely check it out. I'm reading it currently. Well worth your time. It is a tome, though. The other option, though, instead of defining Protestantism as a movement, which is going to have a bit more blurry edges on it, right? A movement's more of an organic thing that can morph and change over time and is characterized more by a sameness of spirit, right? Of an intention rather than by more concrete things. Of course, you could add on to that like the solas or different things, but even those are going to be able to be expressed concretely in very different ways. The second option would be to define Protestantism specifically institutionally by the kind of like 5 or so historic mainline churches that have direct lineage to the Reformers. We could look at like the Episcopal Church here, or kind of like the Church of England might be a better way of saying that, or easier to draw out those connections if you're in the UK. We could also have like that PCUSA. I get so confused with all the different Presbyterian ones. Whatever the one Redeemed Zoomer's in, I believe it's PCUSA. The like LCMS or ELCA, that one's a little foggy. And then you would have as well maybe like some of the historic Baptists. You could throw the Methodists in there, although that's something that comes up that in the video where it gets kind of fuzzy. If I'm leaving anyone out, my apologies, doing this off the top of my head. But the point is that instead of defining Protestantism as a movement, you define it by these key institutions. Now, why does this matter? Well, on this lens, if you are kind of like a non-denominational church, you are not Protestant. You could hold to the 5 solas. You could be kind of advocating for renewal and reform within the broader kind of Catholic lowercase c church. You could take inspiration from the Reformers, but if you're not in one of the institutions, then you're not really Protestant. And I believe this is an argument I think I'm fairly representing Redeemed Zoomer that he's made several times. Now, if you're taking that lens and you want to keep the term Protestant, well, then that's going to kind of help you along this way. You're probably going to go mainline or one of the mainline offshoots. But even at that point, if the offshoots don't count, that's kind of a secondary level of questioning, even within the institutional model, then you'd have to go back up to these mainlines. Whereas if you want to define Protestantism more broadly, I think, the more like non-denominational churches are totally still in view. I'm not going to answer that question quite yet here, but that's just kind of one thing to think through. I think it's ultimately like a really hard question, and my thing that I'd offer you just as maybe a heuristic or a way of approaching this would be thinking of like the Big Ten. If you know the Big Ten in college sports, it's a conference, right? And there's different ways that you could define the Big Ten. The Big Ten could be way more than 10. I think it's like 30 teams or something. Or no, 18? Anyway, more than 10 colleges that participate in that conference, right? They are the Big Ten. Or you could define it as kind of the ethos, the spirit of the Big Ten, because the colleges themselves have changed over time. It's a bit like Theseus' ship, if you're familiar with that famous philosophical idea, right? Where if you change all the boards out, at what point is it still the same ship? Well, with Protestantism, if you change the institutions out, but you have the same kind of formal goal, the same end goal in mind, well then, is it still the same thing? it's a tricky question. I mean, Thespianship is a philosophical quandary, and maybe the Big Ten isn't as much, but it's an opportunity to think through how do you define something that it has potential for change over time, and what is kind of the thread that keeps it going? Is it the spirit, the ethos, the doctrines, or the institutions? I won't answer it for you, but that's something for you to consider as you go through this. The second question, though, is what is the gospel? A thread that kept coming up throughout the conversation is like, when is too much deviation from the gospel cause for schism, or when is schism ever justified? And there's talk about, the Council of Nicaea is thrown out, right? Like, so do you have to affirm the Council of Nicaea, which all of the mainline churches, at least like formally, would do? And is that good enough? Like, as long as they're doing that, are they affirming the gospel? Or as you get kind of further in, if you have questions about, say, an example kind of outside of this would be like if you had questions about Mary and the sinlessness of Mary. Is that a gospel issue? You could get to more cultural questions, right? Like, is having, the blessing of same-sex marriages, is that a gospel issue? I mean, it's not mentioned in the Nicene Creed, but can it be derived from there? Or is it of good and necessary consequence from Scripture? How do we determine where the line is? You could also say things like, women's ordination, or even like around Calvinism and Arminianism. There's certainly people that want to drill this down really, really far to say that all of these issues ultimately are gospel issues. Now, for a long time, I ended all of my interviews on the channel with asking my guests, what is the gospel? And it was both kind of heartening to see how much similarity there was on those answers, despite the guests being, of very different theological stripes. But there also were differences, and the gospel is kind of notoriously, not notoriously, but it can be hard to pin down, right? Because you can define it very inclusively, very minimalistically, or you could try to define it, that all of what the Bible teaches is the gospel, because it all points to Jesus, and gospel is good news about Jesus. So anything that pertains to Jesus is gospel, and disagreements about that would be gospel issues. Now, Redeem Zoomer and Gavin both kind of applauded the nature of theological triage, saying it's a good thing, that we should be, what theological triage is kind of ranking doctrines of orders of importance, and we should be doing that. And there will be some that are gospel issues first tier. There will be some that are worth kind of separating fellowship second tier, but maybe aren't, like, you wouldn't say they're not saved, but you couldn't worship maybe just for practical reasons together, having disagreements over that. Third tier, you could say that these are just kind of disputed ideas, but we can totally hold those together. And maybe fourth tier, like, really doesn't matter at all. It's just conjecture. So within this is another hard thing to determine. Now, my cards on the table, I'm always trying to draw kind of as big of a tent as possible. I'm pretty comfortable with having disagreements with people. It's what I do on my channel. And I find that we have enough in common on the important things to be able to work through even seemingly like really important secondary issues. That also is just part of my disposition, though. I am not someone who minds people telling me they think I'm wrong, or minds being in a place where a lot of people think I'm wrong. I like sitting down in situations like that. And I think also part of my story comes from having gone through a pretty significant kind of like deconstruction. I know people might not like that word, but I think it's fitting. Having gone through a bit of a deconstruction period in late high school and really kind of stepping away from it all, coming back, I just learn to hold a lot of things more loosely, hold tightly to fewer things and loosely to more things. Prior to that, I probably would have been really particular about, being right about every single thing. And now, and increasingly having gone through my undergrad and almost finished my master's, I realized like there's so much I don't know, and I'm just okay with that. And realizing that with more learning, I've become less certain on a lot of things has led me to just be comfortable having a certain level of disagreement. But for other people, that just doesn't work. And I'm not saying that mine is like more commendable. Maybe I'm just wishy-washy on doctrine. I mean, that's entirely possible. But I kind of can't help but see things that way. But for you, you might really thrive in a place where like we clearly define everything. And if they disagree with me on this, like this is a time to shut it down. Look, I get that. I don't think we have the clear answers from Scripture that we'd like on this. We certainly have, if someone teaches you a different gospel, but that just begs the question again, like, right, what is the gospel? And I think no matter who you are, even if someone's listening in from outside Protestantism, this is going to be a hard thing to define. No one's given us kind of like this infallible, this is what the gospel is, and this is what's kind of worth separating ties over. We're all just going to have to use prudence, wisdom, and our best judgment to try to get through that. But the third question of what's most important is going to be downstream from the gospel. So one of the things that Redeemed Zoomer and Gavin Ortlund went back and forth on is this idea of like kingdom theology. How important are the institutions? And I would kind of summarize this in a way by saying, should we prioritize short-term impact or long-term success, right? And so the Reconquista movement, I think, generally has a long-term outlook, whereas evangelicals, I'm not going to say Gavin specifically, tend to prioritize a shorter-term outlook. What does this mean? So with the Reconquista, the whole idea is taking back these institutions, and it's modeled off the idea that the left, whatever that means, has kind of taken over the institutions after kind of a concerted plan to get in at the most influential areas like the universities and kind of sway them in a certain direction of thinking. And that has been kind of a long march, and that has included the churches, and that every time there's been a disagreement, the conservatives left, the liberals have stayed, and that has allowed kind of liberalism to flourish, if you will, in the major institutions. They took a long-term play to have kind of maximum impact in the grand scope of things. Whereas evangelicalism, with its focus on kind of conversion, right? And I've talked before that one of the hallmarks of evangelicalism is this idea of personal conversion. Well, it's going to really going to index on what is like the short-term gain of bringing one person to Christ. Now, of course, that's not short-term, right? Like we're talking about things of eternal impact. But if we look at a more kind of worldly level in terms of changing the culture, it's a little bit more kind of short-term gain, right? Because even if you convert this generation, you're going to have to keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And you might always be fighting an uphill battle against kind of the powerful institutions in the world that are pushing in the opposite direction. Now, there's a really great book on this, To Change the World. I believe it's Hunter Smith, or maybe Hunter's last name. I'll try to link it down below. But he points out that Christians have generally, evangelicals specifically, have struggled to gain kind of like long-term cultural impact and meaningful change because they have taken a more individualistic route rather than the institutional one. That change often, whether we like it or not, does kind of come top down. That if you win like the universities, you win the courts, you win let's say like the Senate seats or these various things, you're going to have trickle down impact in that way versus a lot of grassroots movements. They burn bright and hot, but then they burn fast and they burn out. And this is something that Gavin Ortlund and Redeemed Zoomer, I think, might disagree with on like the facts of it. They talk specifically about the Second Great Awakening and kind of whether or not it was long-term success. But I would grant, not on that particular point, but just generally speaking, if we want to look at change, institutions is going, winning institutions is probably going to have good long-term effects. That being said, I don't think we can discount the short term, right? And this is where all the contingencies and the messiness of human life comes into play. Something that people often point out is like, look, it's one thing for you, Redeemed Zoomer, I don't know, 22, 23, I don't know how old Richard is, to do this, by yourself at first, I think when he started, and then with his wife now. And that's great. But imagine when you have kids and you're asking them, hey, the only, mainline church in town is really liberal. And is that going to work for them? And Gavin, specifically, I think with a really good pastoral heart, kept asking like, hey, if people, aren't being fed at church, if they're going where they should be getting sound preaching and instead they're getting heresy, like, how can we tell people to do that? And, a real concern for like pastorally for the souls of the people involved. And on this matter, I want to say like, yeah, this gets really complicated because I think at a certain level, Redeemed Zoomer is asking you to look at your local church, not always, but oftentimes, as a mission field where you're going to have to do hard work and you're going to have to be swimming upstream for the good of the long-term gain. But that might come at short-term cost of not being in a church where, you could have a small group with a bunch of people your age who are helping you grow in your faith, or having this preaching that week in and week out is really inspiring you to live faithfully for the gospel. And that instead of being fed at church, you're actually kind of having to fight, hopefully very much so, metaphorically. But that's a trade-off there. And when is that trade-off worth it and when is it not? I can't answer that for people. Like, it really is going to depend on your situation. I have a lot of love for what Redeem Zoomer is doing, and I'm going to talk more about how that's even kind of filtered into my own life. But at the end of the day, like, people have to make the decision that's going to be best for them and their family, with regards to their spiritual health. Like, I can't counsel you on this with a blanket statement of like, it's always better to do this than it's better to do that, right? You're going to know you and your kids and your wife or your husband and your family, the people that you love, that you take to church, way better than I ever could, having never met you. And so for you, like, it could absolutely be right, even if you accepted that Protestantism is mainly institutional and that, you could have a vision of the gospel that's more, I guess I should say a vision of the gospel that's a big tent that allows a lot of disagreement. And you could say what's most important generally is long-term impact. Like, you could agree to those three premises and still say that for me and my family, what we need right now, given where we're at spiritually or any of these things, like, we need to go there. And I think one of the rubs here is that in some ways this isn't entirely different than what Richard is saying, but I think the language he uses on this can be a bit abrasive for people. He'll talk about like being a strong or a weak Christian. He'll throw out the words like cowardice. And I get why he's doing it, and I get why he's been successful at what he's doing too, because he's very passionate and he has like a clear direction he's going in. He's inviting people on a mission. Like, there's the famous story of how do you recruit for people? You tell them like the people who are going on the Arctic mission, like long days, low pay, treacherous, like this is going to be bad. And that motivates people, and I get it. At times that can come at the cost of rubbing people the wrong way, right? If you determine that what's best for you and your family is to go to the non-denominational church down the street, like, I've done that same thing in my life at various points, and I don't think that's cowardice. I think that's spiritual care and often maturity, even to try to discern what is best in a given situation. I mean, that's what pastoring is, right? It's applying oikonomia, right? Being able to see what is best in this individual circumstance. And that's just what I would invite people to do. If you think that you are going to find Christ most effectively at the non-denominational church down the street, absolutely go there. I mean, I think sometimes we can miss the forest for the trees here. Yes, we want to have cultural impact. Yes, we want to change the world. Yes, we want to do all these things. But at the end of the day, like, we want to pursue Christ. And we can pursue Christ in doing the work of Christ to build his kingdom on earth, 100%. And also pursuing Christ might be doing what is best for you and your family in that situation. And that might be going to the non-denominational church. Which all brings me kind of to what it's looked like for me. Throughout my journey of kind of discerning the church, I've been intentionally slow. Much to the chagrin's putting it nicely, to the people that watch my videos. And that's intentionally so because I've been doing this for 3 years tomorrow as a married man. And I really value kind of taking my wife along for the journey too, and take very seriously the idea of like spiritually leading our home and trying to help her flourish as well as myself. And for a lot of the time, that's looked like us being in a non-denominational church because that's what made most sense to us. That's what we were used to. And that's where we were really encountering the gospel and having, seeing that bear great fruit. Now, more recently, we've been attending actually a mainline church, an Episcopal church. And is that because like I've settled the debate between Redeemed Zoomer and Young Anglican and everyone else between kind of like Episcopal Church and ACNA? Like, no, it's actually much simpler for me. We saw one near us. It looked beautiful. We went in. They preached the gospel faithfully. They served the poor incredibly. And they're been like a really wonderful community for us. And there's also no ACNA churches near us. And so it's always going to be individual and pastoral. And that's made sense for us. And it's actually led to great flourishing for both myself and for Eliza, having the Book of Common Prayers, the just setup of the church, the liturgy, the community itself. It's been what we've needed in this time. That might sound so hyper individualistic and all of this, but the gospel is ultimately preached to people. And I do also find the idea of kind of having that long-term impact and being able to make a difference in the Episcopal Church and kind of seeing all of those resources and making a difference for the kingdom and taking back, if you will, these wonderful historic churches, like, yeah, that excites me and I get it and I like it. And so it's all aligned, but I think it all does have to align. And that's really just my heart for this, is to maybe free you from some of the anxiety over, am I doing this wrong or right? Like, one step at a time, guys. Pursue Christ and see where that leads you. And where it leads you today might be different than tomorrow, and that's okay.